So, a very good afternoon to you from sunny UK in the Manchester, and thanks for joining in the session today. We're looking at covering, obviously, the last learning outcome in this unit, which is Leadership and Management Development. The learning outcome 4 actually is an interesting one because this focuses on the core aspect of what HR, people in HR or human resources actually do. So it talks about, basically looking at performance and performance appraisals. What is the key role? There are loads of things which HR does, but when we looked at one of the key roles, when we talked about the functions of HR, we did talk about one of the key things is they look at recruitment and selection. Just to recap, they look at things like training and development. They look at union and other things. They look at also managing issues which could arise, which are contemporary issues, ongoing issues. And one of the other key things, apart from whatever functions we discussed, is that the core function of HR, when they look at training and development, and why there is training and development required, actually is an outcome of performance appraisals. So how does HR measure, competence? And looks at, when we looked at the two concepts yesterday, commitment, competence. How do they measure, the employee's productivity, the worth to the organization? And that typically tends to happen through the route which is called performance appraisal. And these, in some organizations, happen, once a year. In some organizations which are quite task-oriented, and are output-oriented, could happen monthly, could happen, quarterly, or even 6 months. So in some cases, this is one of the key, outputs which HR is able to generate when we talk about, looking at doing performance appraisal, because this becomes a key point from where the HR manager, the line manager, the department manager, supervisor, whatever you call it, is able to actually get into understanding, what the employee requires, where the employee's performance is lacking, how the performance can be improved, and in some cases, is the skill set available, and if not available, how that can be improved. So all this starts off by looking at this exercise of something called performance management. And that is what we are going to concentrate on this particular learning outcome 4, which talks about, how do we look at the various methods of performance and evaluation within an organization from an HR perspective. And then we need to learn about some of the methods which are used by HR managers and supervisors, or, people in that position wherein you're managing some staff or employees, and how do you look at, the overall process of managing them in terms of appraisals. So it's an interesting, I would say, learning outcome, and this actually is the heart of the HR function. When we look at, every year, 1 month, or depending on how they happen within the organization, sometimes this becomes the most important and the most key activity, wherein the HR managers actually shine, or kind of it is their time to shine. Let's put it this way. Across the year, it might be sales, manufacturing, those other things, finance, other people. But when it comes to the end of the year, when the appraisals have to be done, that is the time which HR department steps in, and they are kind of the rising star, because they have everything in their control, and they go through this particular process. So I've put together a number of slides in this. I'm not going to be looking at covering all the 59 slides, or 50 odd slides, but the idea is that this particular presentation should give you a detailed coverage of understanding starting with what is performance appraisal, getting into something, what are the reasons and purposes of doing the appraisal, how they are done, and then we will look at the types of methods through which appraisals can be done, and we will also understand to a certain extent different types of appraisals which happen. And some of the slides quite, self-explanatory. So we'll go through some of these to understand the whole process. And as always, if you have any questions, or if you don't understand anything, please stop me there, and I will answer and try and give you more details about using example or an application. Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay. So now let's define performance appraisal. I picked up a definition of performance appraisal, which basically has lots of meanings, and it is known in organizations lots of different terms. Some organizations call it appraisal, some call it review, some call it evaluation. Some also look at, from a developmental aspect, and they will say it is more to do with career development and career progression. In some cases, when you look at small organizations, they call it, okay, once a year we'll have the appraisal, which normally leads to you getting a salary rise or a promotion because you're due for that appraisal. So performance appraisals are basically, as a part of when we look at the HR functions, this is a key part of the training and development side of things within HR, and this looks at progressing employees basis their performance and basis their skills and experience within the organization, and looks at progressing them into their career in terms of forward into their career. So performance appraisal, is a method which is used to evaluate and measure job performance of an employee within the organization. That means how good you're performing in your job role versus your job description. And when we look at that, how good have you been able to achieve the goals and objectives set, would all constitute nothing but performance appraisal. Now, they are a part of training and development department because they are the key. When you find some problems, when you find some gap areas, they have to be filled in by doing training and development. So they are a self, let's put it this way, they are done on self-evaluation basis, but they are also primarily responsible for moving the person towards his career development in terms of moving them forward for developing their career and looking at the overall performance. Let's look at some of the objectives, why this is done. Now, performance appraisals are done, as I can look at, is that look at identifying some of the good things or best practices which are picked up. This person good, the output of his performance or output in terms of his performance has been quite good for the organization. It could be sales revenue, it could be accounting, it could be anything related in that area. What we also want to understand is what are the different types of appraisals which can. So when we look at the key objectives to understand today, we're looking at what is the reason why system management. We will refer to it as PM. We will look at what are the success factors if you have to run a good program or create, as an HR manager, if you have to create a performance management program or a performance appraisal program within the organization, what would constitute a good program and how would you do this holistically so that it covers every aspect of the performance management that you want to do. The other things we'll identify is what are the sources of information that you collate or your line manager or supervisor collates to be able to do this evaluation. That means if I have to evaluate your productivity performance, what are the key factors that I look at picking up from your job description, from your day-to-day activities, which will be used to evaluate your performance across the year in that role. Then we will look at understanding some of the key methods, because how this is done, this is not a rocket science. So we have different methods through which the performance of evaluation is done, and we will need to understand as an HR manager, these are the methods which the industry uses, and these methods you need to be aware of when you are learning this when you're going through this learning outcome 4. And then we will also look at one of the key things what sometimes happens is in the organization is that you will see that employees do not see this as a one-way process. It's a two-way process. That means they will apprise themselves of the activities that you're doing, and at some stage they will give you a judgment. But what they also want to do is, in order to complete the loop that the appraisal has been done and the judgment has been correct, or they've come to the right conclusion, they will also ask for feedback from the person who has been evaluated. And that process normally tends to happen through the interview, wherein you essentially, as a candidate who's undergone the performance appraisal, will provide a bit of feedback. And that feedback could be at two levels. One, it could be something which is to do with if you're staying within the organization, but if you're leaving the organization because of issues, then this feedback comes in the form of something called an exit interview. And that exit interview tends to help HR as a department, capture details or reasons of why the person is leaving, whether the person is leaving on a on a happy note or the person is leaving on a on a negative note. And this is now become a feature within most organizations, that when you end up leaving or when you end up joining, you have an interview at the joining stage. But if you end up leaving the organization, you also have an exit interview to understand if this is something, whether it's a mutual exit, whether you've resigned, and the kind of things that you say you've been dismissed or you've been disciplined. When you sometimes put a reason and you look at some references which come for employee appraisal, if you're joining an organization, sometimes you have references which come in, or you are asked to fill up a reference form. Sometimes they mention that what was the reason of your leaving. Did you resign? Was it a redundancy? Was it mutual agreement? Or was it a dismissal? Was the contract coming to an end? Or did you have, was it a placement that you were doing, like an on-job training and things like that? Or was it another reason? So organizations are keen, but within the organization, the HR manager is very keen and the department is very keen to understand why have you left that role? Or why are you looking at leaving that job role or that organization? And they want to understand as they start the process of recruitment and selection, they go through an interview, but at the exit, when you're leaving the organization, they also want to be able to understand why you are leaving the organization. And those are things that we have to look at, and that will constitute that we have a very good understanding of how the system, what is performance appraisal, what the system is, how it works, what are the methods through which we do performance appraisal, and last but not the least, how do we evaluate using the system the performance of an individual which is currently being appraised. So, couple of things. It does say, it's a single, it's a small outcome with one only, but I think the topic is quite detailed because this actually relates to being one of the key functions within HR, and it's a calendar activity most HR departments get into once a year, or depending on how they do it in terms of their cycle, but once or twice a year, and they look at this system of something called performance appraisal. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's quickly go through some of the concepts. Now, what is the purpose of doing an appraisal? Why do you think, even at home, when you speak to your kid, you ask him or cross-check with him on something, the idea is you wanting to get some feedback. You're looking at maybe apprising yourself of the current situation. But why do you think you look at doing performance, or you look at doing appraisals? Let's forget the word performance for a minute, but let's look at why do we look at doing appraisals? Why do we look at reviewing things?
Okay, basically we review things to know our shortcomings, to know our weaknesses and our strengths, where we've grown over the years and where we are lacking behind, so we can work on those things to be
Absolutely.
better.
So the key word that you said is review. The reason why you look at feedback, or when you look at doing appraisals, is that you want to look at a review in terms of how you've done, what you've done, and how you've done it, and whether this could have been done better. So the process of review actually kicks off the process of something called appraisals. Now here, because the organization is looking at maintaining an overall goal or a target to achieve these set goals by the management, they have to at some stage have a benchmark or a yardstick through which they can review that this is something which is going to happen. And in order to make that certain, what they do is they put the process of something called review or appraisal in place, so that they are apprised of these shortcomings or things which are happening, and they do not come to know of it as a knee-jerk reaction, but also have a predictability to this particular system. And that is where obviously performance appraisals come in. Now, the goal is to maintain productivity, right? Maintain efficiency. Why do you get your car serviced, or why do you get an appliance service? Is because you want the appliance or the car or anything that you run on a daily basis to work well. Every time you start the ignition, you want the engine to start, and that is where you get service once a year, or maybe twice a year. Similarly, the goal of doing performance appraisal within the organization is to ensure that the productivity is there within the organization, and they're able to year on year achieve the objectives as being set, by the management. Now, productivity is directly related to individual performance. Now, you employ people within the organization because you want certain activities or work to be done. Now, if you have to, if for example, in some cases, to understand this point is, if, for example, in some cases you do not have staff and you want to accomplish that, you know that there's a gap that we are not able to do this because we do not have adequate people in place to be able to do or achieve those things. But when you put people in, you expect people to be able to do their job and their roles and this then moves things forward from a point of view of efficiency and performance within the organization. Why do we look at goals? Now, goals, we've heard about an acronym called SMART goals. Most organizations today use this because what they want to be able to do is, if the CEO of the organization says that I want to achieve, say, an X amount of growth for the organization this year, or an X amount of turnover for the organization this year, he set very big, large, or a very generic macro goal, which means nothing to the employee in the organization. So when those goals are broken down into micro objectives or individual objectives, which are set for individuals to be able to achieve, that then would help the organization achieve that macro goal or the bigger objective. And that is where it needs to be carefully monitored and carefully set so that the goal matches the skill set and the job description of the employee, and the employee is able to perform individually and contribute as a larger part of the team to be able to achieve the goal of the organization. So that is why we will see that one of the reasons why you are apprised or you are basically going through this activity is that at certain stage, all organizations, all departments, HR in particular, wants to ensure that you are in control and you are able to achieve something which has been given to you as an objective or as a goal, and that will be achieved because you have the right deliverables available going forward. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when we look at, what are the basic objectives that I understand, sometimes you will see employees very excited to find out, okay, now it's that month of the year where my appraisal is going to happen and I'm going to be up for a promotion or a salary rise. So some of the objectives that we look at, when you look at why performance appraisals are done, they are basically done to discuss results. And results discussion can only happen basis the review. So the second point is they identify strengths and weaknesses, as you rightly said earlier. So you do a SWOT, you see what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and basis that you do a review and you come to an appropriate conclusion that whether I've met the results or met the objectives which were set, and that process through which we go through, becomes the objectives of something called the performance appraisal. And I think in most organizations, when people go through this system of appraisals, there are only two outcomes which they normally expect would happen. One is if they will get a rise in their salary or wages, or the second one will be that they will get additional job role, responsibility, increase in role or responsibility. And in some cases, if you put in a number of years of work in that particular position or that job role, you're up for a promotion. So appraisals are that part, when it comes to appraisal, that part of the year, or towards the financial year for the organization, it typically symbolizes that these are the four reasons why the appraisals would happen. And that would be to look at reviewing the results, discussing the strengths and weaknesses, so which is a bit of discussion to understand what you can do in the following year, what are your strength areas, what is your interest, where you want to go. And then after that discussion, you look at, whether you're up for if you achieve 100% or over 100%, you're up for a bit of a rise in your salary. And, obviously, if you've worked in that department for a number of years and you're looking for a change, and the organization then considers, promotion and recommendations.
Okay.
Now, some of the main purposes of performance, it's an exciting time of the year. Everybody is excited because they're looking forward to having a change in job description, getting maybe more responsibilities. But the main motivator tends to be always something which is related to, the financial side of things. That is increase either in salary, maybe you are up for, receiving a bonus or an incentive. In some cases, managements in large companies end up receiving employee stock option plans. That means they get a lot of stocks which they can divest because they have lock-in periods. So like if you look at companies like Apple, Facebook, Google, any company which is a global 500 company, and you have turnover in hundreds and thousands of millions of pounds, dollars, there you will see the top management sees this as a time wherein they are for major topics or which are major payouts, which in terms of primarily looking at okay, they had received ESOP as we call it. So one of the terms that we end up using specifically when we talk about say for example one of the key incentives which some of the main management typically gets is something which we call about, is ESOP, which is Employee Stock Option Plan. So when we look at that, they typically tend to be quite excited because for them, this is that time of the year wherein they get employee stock option or plan, wherein they get this for 2 years, 3 years, and within those 2-3 years, they are able to then divest into these shares. And for them, it means larger payouts. But let's look at some of the other points which talk about, things like individual rewards. Sometimes you're up for a promotion, you've done quite well, you've won an incentive trip, and those tend to be, individual rewards. Sometimes you get feedback which is collected from, sometimes you get, feedback which is primarily collected in terms of, feedback from your subordinates, and those could be under the 360-degree performance appraisal that we'll also cover, and sometimes they have plus and minus points that are talked about. The other thing that we look at is sometimes you get specific awards which is for your superlative performance. That means you've been able to accomplish or get something for the organization which was beyond expectation, and that is where a special recognition or an award is given. Sometimes you will see that appraisals also end up discovering weak performances, and because of the weakness that has been discovered because of the performance appraisal, they end up putting you into some sort of a monitoring mode, or in some cases training and development, so that you are able to get that skill which will help to improve your performance. This performance appraisals also are a way of looking at personal decision making. Sometimes when you're working in a particular role and you've been working for a number of years, what you tend to do is the appraisal itself gives you a bit of feedback that how well you performed in that role, what are the key responsibilities you've executed, and what has been the result. And that then tells you into a bit of an introspection that sometimes you see, I've worked in this company for 5 years, I've accomplished this, I've moved from here to here, I've accomplished this, I've got this, I've achieved that. And you then think that it's a personal goal, okay, I think it's time for me to move on. The reason is because you feel that the company does not offer more growth opportunities or the opportunities that you're looking at in terms of growth areas. And sometimes PAs or performance appraisals tend to be introspection document for your own personal decision making as well, which is to look at your career goals and your career development. And then last but not the least, from an organizational point of view, if you are put on a leadership management program, which is what we discussed yesterday, say LDP program, what it tends to do is this tends to be a benchmarking document to say your performance is bettering or getting better year on year, and that helps to keep track of as a document or as a graph, maybe as a table, that year on year you are getting better on this, and this means that you have been looking at going towards a promotion, you have been looking at going towards an additional responsibility in the department or in the place of work, and that helps to set future goals. You will see that sometimes when the performance appraisal happens, there is a bit of a discussion which tends to happen with the employee and the manager and the person being appraised, saying that I have this in mind for you when we look at 2 years down the line. There's a bit of a peeping into the crystal ball to say that, okay, how do I see yourself being in that role in 2 years, 3 years, and 5 years? So this is a bit of a motivational, pitch which is being made by the manager to give him a bit of an idea or give her a bit of an idea that, okay, if these future goals and commitments are met, then you're in line for achieving this, or you're in line to achieve this promotion and things like that. So those are also commitments which the HR looks at doing towards the end of the appraisal, so that they are able to get that motivational commitment from the employee, and also the loyalty and a bit of let's put it this way, commitment to stay further in the organization. But sometimes you'll say, okay, I get the 3% rise every year, or I get this every year, but there's nothing beyond this. So how do they look at exciting you or getting you excited to stay further in the company and look at further commitments in terms of loyalty and performance within the organization? Is they will build up some future goals for you for 1, 2, 3, 5 years to say that, okay, if you continue doing this and you're continuing to be successful, you are able to get to this stage. At this stage, you will have this promotion. So it's a bit of a roadmap. Sometimes employees also end up asking that what if my performance is good, and what if I do this, what will I get at the end of the year, or at the end of the performance appraisal? And that tends to be commitments which you get from HR from a personal growth point of view. Is that okay?
Yes, please. Sorry. Before we go to the next slide, could you please explain feedback for subordinates, plus and minus? I really do not understand that.
So in this point, what we are looking at is one of the types of performance management or appraisal system which happens within the organization talks about a 360-degree feedback. That means you are not only apprised by your superior or your line manager, but you're also apprised by your peers. That means who work with you in the same department, and also people who are junior to you in the organization. And some organizations follow a 360-degree performance appraisal. That means you're going to be reviewed by your peers, your subordinates, and also by your superiors. So here the feedback from subordinates is taken. Sometimes if you're a department manager or a head line manager for a department, what they tend to look at is they tend to ask you, when your appraisal happens, they tend to ask and also find out whether this is something, you are talking about it, you're talking great about it, but we need to know whether the employees working in your team or in your department are happy with the performance and the way you're governing or running that department. So there the feedback from subordinates is taken to ensure that the line manager or the boss is primarily in a position which is he's governing with the right leadership style, and he's promoting the right set of development opportunities for others in his department. Okay. So we'll come to this. Now, looking at the reasons, some of the reasons we've covered. So reasons are, let's summarize this on the slide. Reasons, when that time of the year comes, when you have results, you're looking at compensation is paid for performance. So apart from your base salary, what you're looking at is if you've achieved something higher than what was set, you're expecting that you will get performance pay or bonus or incentive, as we call it. Sometimes you will see there are some job performance improvements which can also be included in performance appraisal, and these could be that they normally set some sort of slab that if you achieve this, you get that. If you achieve this, you get this. If you achieve this, you get that. So that is something which is job performance improvements. We'll look at that in a bit more detail. You look at reasons sometimes is that if the HR manager discovers that a lot of staff is leaving within the department. Now, one or two things that they have to straight away introspect and look at would be, why is that there is a lot of staff turnover in that department? So what they want to be able to do is, rather than do the appraisal or the feedback from the line manager or the department manager, they want to look at now finding out feedback from subordinates, where the people are leaving or in which department at that level the people are leaving. So in that case, the feedback from subordinate becomes very important.
Okay.
The other thing that we look at is, in this system, when HR does performance appraisal, they document everything, because today what can happen is, because of the law and legislation, you have unions and other legislation which is available, wherein the employee can go and obviously represent that I've been unfairly dismissed, or I've not been done this and I've not done that. So in those cases, documentation for HR becomes all the more important. So here in this case, when you look at reasons for appraisal, once a year they have to document that the documents have to be recorded, and this recording typically of the performance appraisal happens to create documentation on the basis of which HR, the line manager, senior management, whosoever is involved, actually take decisions for the future. Now, when you look at across once the year, when these appraisals happen, they discuss the new year targets with you. They discuss new goals with you, because if you've been able to achieve the previous goals, then this system also looks at setting goals for you for the future. And that is where goal setting also happens, when an appraisal is done once a year. Obviously, promotion decisions, if you've been in that job for a couple of years, have been doing well, and you're in line to get a promotion, then decisions to promote will also be done, and that will be based on documentation. It's like 3 years performance, performance and appraisals from subordinates, peers, and colleagues. They all feel that the person is helpful, is loyal to the organization, is motivated enough, is a good leader, or is a good person to be promoted, and they look at those decisions. Earlier that PA as a system looks at identifying gaps, and that is where it becomes a starting document at training and development. Training needs are identified. One of the key things which HR picks up from the appraisals is the need for planning, HR planning as a process. Now, if in the appraisal it comes to light that this person is going to be leaving, then HR also kicks off the planning, in the process of planning, because they need to be able to find a replacement, because that person will end up giving a notice period, and that notice period would mean that that will finally become a vacant position. So HR starts the process of planning on that side as well. The other side would be, if you look at the other perspective, would be if the person is being promoted, then somebody has to, from the same department, if the person is being promoted, somebody has to take up the position which is becoming vacant when the other person is being promoted. So that also leads to HR planning. So planning also is related closely to this function of something called performance appraisal. Now, this table actually looks at risk data, wherein it gives you some in terms of what reasons or what are all the benefits which this system or performance appraisal is able to achieve for organizations. So when you look at various parameters or reasons of why appraisals are done, this is how most organizations actually put it. So in small organizations, performance appraisals are seen as an opportunity to increase compensation, increase in salary, bit of rise in salary. In large organizations, it's 66%, and if you do a mean between small and large, 74% or 75% of people normally when we talk about performance appraisal and the first thing which comes to their mind is, okay, I'm in line for promotion, I'm going to get a rise in my salary, and that is where compensation becomes one of the key factors which comes to mind when people talk about performance appraisal. And the primary use. Then we look at improvement. People see this as a method to look at improving, because they are then identified into putting, what you call into training and development. And that is why you see performance improvement and training and development going hand in hand when the activity like performance appraisal is concluded. HR in particular as a department thinks about and sees this as a very important duty, because they get feedback, because it's a one-on-one discussion, and you will hear all perspectives of why the employee is happy, not happy, what is going right, what is going wrong, and what are the areas in which improvements need to be done. So this is the mechanism for HR department, HR manager in particular, to get first-hand feedback or horse's mouth feedback about what are the things they like, do not like, and that is why it is important. And more or less 40% of the people see this as an opportunity to give feedback to the employer using this system. Staff part of it is to do with documentation, promotion, training, transfers. If you look at large organizations, people who work within various departments, various positions, roles, at some stage, get posted as expat, and you are a prime example. Ollie is a prime example. That he's come across as a diplomat into a different country because he is good in what he does, and obviously, slight bit of transfer means that here you are in line to become a transfer, you become a branch head, you become a regional head, or you become a country head, and these are promotional related aspects. But here, it is like a bit of a soap or a bit of an incentive, and that is why you sometimes look at transfer. It could be negative to a certain extent, that if you're not performing well in a particular department, particular office, the company decides not to make you redundant, but they say, okay, let's transfer him so that he's work in a new position, or transfer him to a less important position, and those could be both having a positive and a negative effect. So some of the reasons are actually listed here, and these are reasons why performance appraisals are done within the organization. Now, let's get briefly going through a couple of slides. What are the trends of managing performance? Why this is required? We talked about the concept of competence and commitment yesterday. So when we look at performance appraisal, we are looking at basically appraising and evaluating versus managing performance. Sometimes you will see there are briefings which are done from a point of view of making you aware, and those are appraising meetings. Like there's a health and safety check happening in the organization, or if you've joined the organization as a new employee, you go through the induction procedure within the organization, get an employee handbook, and this is more of an appraising process because they are wanting to make you aware of the code or the things that you are needing to be you need to follow. But when it comes to evaluating, They are looking at you being evaluated in that role, in that position, in that role responsibility, because you have been working in that position for a number of months, days, weeks, years, whatever it is. And that is where the trend in terms of looking at differences. What is appraisal? What is evaluating? And how is managing performance coming into it? So evaluating is nothing but performance appraisal. But when you're looking at managing performance, you're looking at day-to-day operations and ensuring that you're able to get that output and efficiency from employees. And that is where the concept of managing performance also comes in. Now, to give you an example here, sometimes you will see the CEO of the organization is apprised of certain events or activities which have happened. And he needs to look at making a judgment or a decision which is going to be a policy decision. Now, he is being apprised of a situation on which a decision has to be done. Then you look at a situation wherein sometimes you will get to hear that after the performance evaluation was done or appraisal was done, what was evaluated was that these are the structured. These are these are the areas in which the organization needs development, and they are identified as areas for which the development is required. And if this development is done, then overall the efficiency and the performance of the organization will increase. But that evaluation is not done from perspective of individual, but as a collective whole done in the organization. And that is where the difference would be. You look at evaluating. Now, an example here would be the organization is looking at moving an office. What they will look at is they will evaluate their options to see whether if we move the office, the HR would say if number of employees would stay, would they go, would some of them find it difficult, would they end up looking at leaving the organization. So here they are looking at evaluating the options before the decision is taken. Do you see the difference?
Mm-hmm.
And then when we talk about managing performance, we are talking about, how do you manage the people or the responsibility that you have in terms of employees on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-on-month basis. And the idea here would be to look at managing the output of the employee vis-a-vis the job description and the responsibility given. So if you're able to manage it well and you're able to get the work done from your employees, from the staff that you have responsibility for, then your performance or the output that you're able to get is measured and related to a performance, and you're in line for, say, awards, bonus, incentives, because overall the department is doing quite well or it is meeting and exceeding its targets. But when you look at specific goals, how much is the contribution of individual person in achieving the overall goal, that is where the managing of performance of that individual will happen. So an example here would be if there are 5 people in the sales team and they have been given a target to achieve, say, $1 million in terms of turnover across the year, what will happen is overall the team has achieved the target. That is fine. That means the leader or the team leader has been able to manage the team in such a way that the overall goal and objective has been met. But when we talk about the individual performance of contributions, individual contributions of how much of the contribution is coming from individual employees, that is where you look at managing the individual performance. Some people would have contributed, say, 200K, somebody would have contributed 100K, somebody would have contributed 500K, and somebody would have contributed 50K and 70K. That would mean that overall the department has achieved the target. But when we look at managing individual performance or looking at individual contributions in terms of performance, we will look at individuals saying you were given a target of 200, but you only achieved 50. That means you're underperformed, or you're not able to meet the target. But somebody who was given a target of 200 has ended up doing 300, would mean that individually he has not only met the goal but also exceeded the goal. So here, when we look at managing performance and we look at appraisals, we are looking at understanding how performance is to be managed, and there are 3 key areas which will be covered. One will be appraisals, one will be evaluation, and the third will be looking at overall performance of the individual versus the goals actually set. Now, who does the performance appraisals and what kind of appraisals So let's look at, sometimes we work within an organization and you have a tiered structure. That means you are in the frontline sales or dealing with customers, you are at the lowest level, then you have somebody who's a supervisor, and you have somebody who's a manager, general manager. So you have a matrix structure, and sometimes you're in the organization, you have a flat structure. Depending on the structure and the culture of the organization, the appraisal system will vary. So if you are working, and your responsibility in terms of managing you comes or rests with the supervisor, your immediate performance appraisal is done by your supervisor. He knows what you're doing in day out.
Okay.
Sometimes you will see, when you look at senior management or senior management or people high up in the organization, there you will see the board or the company board or the non-executive directors do the appraisal. Sometimes you will see if you are working as an individual, you're not a integral part of an organization in terms of as a contractor, or if you work as your work is very individual rather than somebody managing you directly. Sometimes organizations also then look at doing self-appraisals. That means they say, okay, because you were working alone, you were given this responsibility, there was not really much team coordination or working within the team, could you do a self-appraisal? Sometimes organizations look at appraisals which are done by co-workers. That means they are doing peer appraisals, and we look at that in a subsequent slide. And then if you work as part of large teams, sometimes your appraisals tend to happen when the appraisal is done from a point of view of team perspective, and they tend to be evaluation appraisals which are done for a bunch of individuals together as a team. And then if you look at most tertiary organizations, organizations in the tertiary sector, that means which are dealing with customers directly or are providing services, then in those cases, you also look at getting feedback or data which is collected from surveys and feedback, and that is by appraisal done by the customer. A relevant example at this stage would be if you buy something from Amazon and you do not receive the product, you receive a faulty product, you go back to Amazon. There's somebody at the call center, will pick up the phone, speak to you, they will apologize, they'll offer you a free replacement. And when that is being done and your problem has been resolved, what they tend to do is they will say, okay, at the end of the call, you'll be asked to take a small feedback survey or a free small, feedback questions to be able to feedback if I was able to deal with your query or was able to solve your issue or problem successfully. And the reason why they are doing this is because you're dealing directly with the customer, and they want to see that if the customers were happy for the reason which they had called and has that problem been resolved. So in some cases, the appraisal is done by the customer. And then we also look at an approach that we'll talk about for the 360 degrees. Let's look at quickly some of the terms. What is supervisor appraisal? Performance appraisal by employee manager, and often reviewed by a manager at a higher level, one higher level. That means if you work as if you work within the company, say for example in accounts department, and you are say for example an accounts executive, your appraisal will be done by the accounts manager, and then it will be signed off by the chief financial officer or maybe the financial controller who's the head of the department. So there will be 5 or 6. Say if you look at an accountancy firm, and there are 5 or 6 accounts, and trainee accountants. Their appraisal is done by the manager, and manager's appraisal that has been done has been signed off by the head of that department, or it could be the head of the organization also, and that will serve to be something called a supervisor appraisal. What is self-appraisal? Self-appraisal, as I earlier talks about appraisal by an employee himself, and general appraisal form is, and you are supposed to complete that form to the best of your abilities. So what they tend to do is they'll give you a form and they'll say, can you self-appraise yourself? That means, can you check and rate your own performance in terms of how you've done? And that tends to be a self-appraisal. Once that is being done and completed, that document is normally picked up by, say, for example, the department manager or the owner of the organization, and he then puts his own comments or ranking next to it, saying that, okay, I think it's been fair, it is okay, this is something which is the person has done, and then they look at this as a process of closing the appraisal. Now, this kind of a thing, you will see it happens mostly with contractors. People who are indirectly working with an organization, it is important that they are seen to be a part and parcel of the organization because they are part-time or employed as a contractor. You will see that the HR department puts them through something called a self-appraisal process. And this to be with most organizations wherein people are working contract, part-time, or as a contract. Now, what is a subordinate appraisal? Somebody who is working below you or as a junior to you is also able to do appraisal. And in the case, if you are the manager, but you are currently also appraised by a staff that you manage, and that would be called a subordinate appraisal. A peer appraisal will be people who work with you side by side. They have responsibility. They are the same level. They will look at basically doing your appraisal, and that is called something which is called a peer appraisal. Appraisal talks about performance of the team being evaluated, and that then is basically related to something called total quality management. As a concept, what it
Quality
is
management.
TQM, called TQM, total quality management. Because in this case, your individual performance does not matter. It's the performance of the team which matters. So if as a team you are able to, like, you look at the 400 relay marathon which happens, the 100 by 400, wherein you have 4 runners running, but all of them are running the 100 meters. It does not matter whether somebody ran slow or somebody ran fast, but as long as the team is able to win the relay, the team wins. So here the individual performance does not carry much, any higher relevance than the team performance. Team performance becomes important, and here the concept that is clear about or talked about is primarily the team performance being able to achieve the performance or the required goals and objectives which have to be met, because the individual's performance is not that important. So here it is recognizing the team and the club accomplishment that they are able to do as against individual. So like you look at who's the first runner in the world? Who's the first runner?
Hello?
Yeah, do you know who's the fastest runner in the world?
Usain Bolt. I don't know if someone has taken over.
Usain Bolt. So when you look at Usain Bolt, he won the last, in the Olympics, he won the 100 meter, 200 meter, and the 400 meter. So when you look at the 100 meter, that is individual performance. When you look at the 200 meter individual performance, but when you look at a 400 meter or an 800 meter relay, that race has team performance in it. He obviously has put in his own effort, but the other team players who ran with him in the team to win that relay have also contributed to the performance. So here the importance of team performance if you have to win the relay, not individual performance. Okay. Then we look at something called 360-degree appraisal. 360-degree appraisal comprises of everybody in the organization appraisal. So if you are an individual and you work, in a particular department, and if the company follows this appraisal system, what that would mean is your supervisor, your immediate manager will review you, your subordinates will review you, your peers will review, and also customers in some cases will review you. And this tends to be in a position wherein you work either at the very top of the organization, and it is seen that you are a role model, and they want to see if you are able to perform and come across on the expectation of each and every person working in the organization, and that is where they tend to do something called a 360-degree appraisal. So CEOs of the organization, when you look at taking somebody on who's going to be the public face of the organization, who's going to be somebody which will lead the whole organization, they tend to see that, okay, is that person going to be likable? Is that person going to be having a positive impact? How do the customers see them? See him as or her as a leader, and then they look at the whole system and they look at the whole package. And the whole package essentially means that they look at taking an appraisal or a feedback from all the different stakeholders involved, and that is where it constitutes for the 360-degree appraisal. It could also happen in organizations wherein you see that customer, or for example, somebody who is the center of the most important part of the ecosystem, and in those cases, what they tend to do is they look at taking feedback from all possible sections to ensure that the choice they are making or the person which is representing them is liked by all, because they are also key stakeholders in the business. So when you look at elections, for example, right? If you look at the general elections which happen as an example, you tend to see that it's not just voting. And I'm going to give you an example of the US electoral system. So when they try and shortlist a party candidate, they go through those primaries, and the candidate has to go through all the primaries to be able to, all the 12 primaries to be able to be nominated as a candidate for the party to stand and represent the party. So what they are doing is they're going through all the constituencies, all the major, conventions to ensure that the person is vetted, voted, and liked by before they get him to become the leader of the party. And then that person, when he wins the primaries, is then able to then go forward and obviously, look at becoming the main candidate for, fighting the elections on that behalf. So here the appraisal is happening at all levels: subordinates, various teams at the primary level, at the constituency level, councillor level, mayoral level, and at the party level. And it is like it is an example of, say, a 360-degree appraisal. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Right. Now, some of the things that we look at.
Can I say something? Yes, when you talked about the self-appraisal that you'll be issued a form to fill based on what you've done and everything. Now, the thing is, I feel sometimes when it comes to self-appraisals, some people exaggerate in the sense that they tend to add what they don't even do.
Correct.
Just for them to fill the whole pages of the form. I'm saying this based on experience, because where I work in Nigeria, at the end of the year, you'll be issued a form, a performance evaluation form, to evaluate yourself, talk about things you've done for the organization, your innovation and everything. Now, most times, even those that don't do anything, you see them writing so many stuffs. And you're asking yourself, really, did you really do this? Now, the place where they now shoot themselves in the leg, because after writing that, the form will be sent to the board of directors, that's the management team, to review. After they review it, later on you would write an exam. It's like you write a promotional exam. Then after you go through the promotional exams, you go for an interview. And that's where you see the board of directors. You see the management team. Now, from what you filled in your evaluation form, which most of them do not know, and that's why they lie about some things. From what you've written, they could ask you questions based on what you filled for yourself. That you say you've been doing this. Could you cite an example for us what you've done? And there was a day a woman was asked, because she said she produces a program on air, on radio, and she called the title of the program, and they just asked her a simple question: do you still produce the program? She said yes, and they were like, okay, the last edition, could you tell us what was treated, the topic for last week? And she couldn't answer because she's not even on the team.
Correct.
She doesn't produce that program, and she just wrote it there because she just wanted to fill space. She was thinking they wouldn't know. And they just asked her that question, and that was it. She couldn't answer. So I feel when it comes to the self-appraisal thing, most people lie about their job description. Some people, exaggerate because they want to fill spaces. They want to fill the pages of the form, and they want to impress the management. But if the management does not go a bit further by doing the interview session, they wouldn't have known that the person is lying.
I totally agree.
So I feel even if you're doing the self-appraisal thing, it shouldn't be based on that alone. You should move a bit further to investigate if truly this person is doing this.
Yeah. So basically, it's a valid question that you asked, but just to share with you very briefly that what will happen is that when this process is picked up, in terms of self-appraisal, this, as I mentioned to you, is primarily done, for situations or let's look at employees wherein they directly do not tend to be a part of the organization. And the other bit that you look at is will be done when the self-appraisals are done as a technique before the performance appraisal is done. And the reason why they do it is because they want to see how does the employee actually evaluate their own performance in terms of their strengths and weaknesses, what they did right and what they did not do right, or what are the areas in which they need to develop. So self-appraisal is not an appraisal in its own. It is one of the systems through which the organization, looks at giving the opportunity to the employee to basically talk about freely. When sometimes you hear that, okay, can you give me let's talk freely. Let's give feedback, open feedback. So this is an opportunity given in organizations wherein which are lots of people are working, and sometimes when they want to discover key issues or areas of issues which are troublesome for the organization, they look at the process of self-appraisal, and in those cases, sometimes these appraisals are done anonymously. That means they will ask for feedback. There is a suggestion box which you normally see in some organizations is there, and that is basically done so that they are able to capture some of the key issues which are troubling the organization or the departments, and that is where the performance appraisal starts off with self-appraisal rather than just being an appraisal system on its own. Do you understand? Okay, let me just share my screen because I have to look at checking something. So here in this case, what you're looking at is, self-appraisal being one of the tools which actually starts off the performance appraisal cycle, so that this could be looked at as an activity to begin, the system of appraisal within the organization. Okay.
Yes.
But typically, if you see, this normally is done in the case of contractors or people who are not directly employed by the organization.
Okay.
So if I just go back now and then share that with you, what you will basically see is that this is one of the things wherein a performance appraisal is done by the employee being evaluated generally on the appraisal form completed by the employee prior to the review. So sometimes what will happen is you'll see there's a situation wherein what they will say, okay, can you give us your opinion first? And they will ask you to do your appraisal yourself, some of the key areas. Now, it does not form the full appraisal document, but it will have some areas which will conform to the overall appraisal being done. And the idea is to capture the employee's own self-evaluation in this part when the self-appraisal as an activity is done. Okay, there are some positives and disadvantages, or advantages and disadvantages that you mentioned, and that tends to be an opportunity giving option rather than being a conclusive appraisal, which is done, or as an approach conclusive part done by the organization. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there are problems which come across sometimes when you look at performance appraisal, and those problems could be talked about. Things like it's not a popularity contest. There are some punitive implications which sometimes would mean that if you've not done a fair appraisal and the employee feels that the appraisal has not been done in the right spirit, then sometimes you will see that there are cases which come up, or unfair disposals which come up. Could be the repercussions of punitive implications, which primarily mean that in some cases it could be inflicting or intending to do give punishment. So appraisals sometimes they say, okay, I'm not popular with the manager, and I think my appraisal, I know he's going to take this opportunity to kind of get back to me, and that means he's intending to give you punishment in the form of appraisal. But some employees sometimes feel that way, and they fear away the process, that the process of appraisal is an opportunity with the employer to actually give intended negative feedback as against positive feedback. Sometimes you will see that it also looks at controlling or relinquishing control. Now, if you're getting promoted, if you're getting into that position wherein you'll be able to do the appraisal, what you're looking at is primarily a mechanism in which that person now will have the responsibility to do the appraisals as against get appraisals or being appraised by somebody. Appraisals also kind of are seen as a problem because it tend to talk about stereotypes. That means you are looking at sometimes you're looking at people which basically will do appraisals in a particular fashion, or they will follow a particular person who has been doing appraisals, and then they see this as a process which is kind of fixed, or as a process which is just a process being done as a checkbox exercise within the organization. They know that what I'm going to get a a bit of a rise in the salary. I'm not due for promotion, so it just kind of is seen as a stereotype exercise or a checkbox exercise to say that okay, this is like the process that I go through every year, but nothing changes. And sometimes what you do see is that after the appraisal has been done, the companies do end up taking feedback on how the appraisal as an activity was it, and they ask you to rate the person who has done your appraisal and pick up on areas wherein if this was relevant or not relevant. And in those cases, you will see some ratings also happening. Now, having understood the process, there is lots to read into this. So I will, send you a bit of a document which will help you understand why, and this is one of the important tools which HR managers have, and how this tool is to be used in balance to discover problems, to discover issues, or discover discrimination or treatment which is happening with employees, and this tends to come out using this particular activity. Now, there are some negative aspects of appraisals. When we say there are appraisals, when you do like peer appraisals which are happening, or in peer appraisals, if I have to appraise you as a colleague and you and me are together or at the same level in the organization, if I don't get well with you, I might give you some bad appraisal or a bad remark in the appraisal. That happens. So what are the advantages and disadvantages? Why do they only to you, but they all go to, when you talk about 360 degree, they tend to weed out the appraisals which are overtly negative. So what their idea is, if they go to 10 people to talk about you as a peer, as a subordinate, they will take a feedback from 10 people, but if somebody has been very harsh or very negative, that would kind of stand out because all the others would have rated you in one particular fashion or in one particular type of description, but one or two employees who are kind of not getting on with you well or have a bit of animosity or don't appreciate what you do, then they tend to kind of give you a bit of brickbat or So in those cases, what we tend to do is we pick up something called the rating errors. That means sometimes you will see that there are extremes you get in terms of evaluation, and those extremes have to be kind of looked at. Now here, these extremes could be in the form of rating errors. Like means if somebody appraised you and they're quite lenient or they've been quite strict. Sometimes you see there's a tendency to be quite in the middle. That means they're not going too overtly negative, too overtly positive, and they're just doing a checkbox exercise. They're not very open to giving you feedback or very open to giving areas of improvement, and they're just following this as a process. And sometimes you will see there is something called the recency error, which means when we talk about these type of errors like leniency, you have a recency error, and that means that in some cases there is an inaccurate feedback which has been captured in your appraisal, and that tends to be a kind of an error, and that is called the recency error. So let's look at some of these errors which happen in a bit more detail. Now, error of central tendency. This means, what does this central tendency mean? This is a commonly known as tendency because when managers and interviewers rate other employees, what they tend to do is they do the rating from a point of view of in a particular process. An example of this would be an interview process. So when they have to look at whether you like the candidate, do not like the candidate, you have to give some reasons of why you do not like the candidate, why do you think is not suitable for the candidate to join. And these errors sometimes tend to be related to, called the central tendency error. That means you want to be safe rather than sorry. So here, the term performance appraisal and when we use central tendency is more attributed to looking at the recruitment and interviewing process. Then we talk about something called leniency or strictness. That means my manager has been very strict, my manager has been very lenient. So this is showing a bit of bias. That means either you're being very biased towards the performance or unbiased towards the performance, and that's why you tend to go towards the extremes, either very lenient, very positive, or very negative, either very strict or being very lenient. Recency errors basically talk about if you picked out some inaccuracy or flaws in the performance appraisal process. That, okay, I was asked these questions, but my colleague was not asked these questions. I was rated on this particular parameter, but my colleague wasn't rated in this parameter. So those are recency errors. That means there is an error wherein you have asked some things to one person undergoing performance appraisal and not ask the other applicants or other person going through the same process. So you have been biased in the sense that you've used some things for one, and for the other you've skipped or not used those things, and that is why you have these called what is called the recency errors. Now, if you have to look at drawing up a scale, these errors typically fall for halo, leniency, and recency errors. Now, so means you're basically looking at something which is happening perfectly well, and the person is rated by peers, subordinates, colleagues. Everybody finds him to be an excellent, and that is where the performance appraisal sets a tone that you are on the top. Everybody is on the right. They have the right opinion. That means everybody's opinion is right, and that opinion tends to coordinate to being the same opinion. So people, when they talk about he's a great leader, everybody would say he's a great leader. That means everybody is agreeing to the statement that he's a great leader, and that is why that rating tends to be true, and that is what is called halo or halo. Now, other rating errors, leniency, central tendency, and bias. Recency bias could be tending to talk about things which are excellent, average, or poor. So recency errors would basically point to poor indicators. Central would be safe side, that you're wanting to play safe. You do not want the opinion or the performance appraisal to say that it's very good or very below average, but you want to go in the medium, and that is where it is average. Now, leniency errors, because it is showing a bit of bias, sometimes you can be biased towards being negative or biased being towards positive. In general cases, this tends to create a rating scale wherein managers are lenient towards when they're doing the performance appraisal, and they tend to point towards either you're excellent, you're superior, or you're excellent, very good, and superior, or you're excellent, very good, superior, or fair. And this is a rating scale which you can have when you do appraisals across a section or a number of employees in the organization. Is that okay?
Okay, but can I ask you now, to avoid these errors, these issues when it comes to rating employees? How do I put it now? What should one focus on? Like, you talked about the halo rating one.
Yeah. Everybody.
Now, how do you establish that of the halo? Is it that everybody would rate the employee from the management down to the subordinate, or what?
That is correct. So when you look at the halo error, what tends to happen is that everybody who's going to be involved in the process of doing performance appraisal will have the same rating for that person, or that for that particular person who's being appraised. And in that case, the rating agrees with all the people what they are saying about that person. Okay. And that is why, because there's an agreement and everybody tends to agree that, okay, this is something which is true, this is something which is correct, then that rating tends to be, creating a rating scale which talks about that, okay, this is in agreement with everyone who has done or has an opinion related to doing an appraisal.
Okay.
Now, this is and these errors, when we look at, are a part and parcel of the appraisal system, because in all organizations you will have what you call a scale, and the scale will basically look at rating you once your appraisal is done across that particular scale. Because how do you decide as a HR department that, okay, this is considered excellent, this is considered very good, this is considered good, this is considered fair, and this is considered below average? So you have to have some scale before you get into this whole process of doing performance appraisal. And that scale is normally developed and approved by the management within the HR department. And when that has been approved, what we tend to do is we tend to flag off errors or areas of bias which could happen when you do this performance appraisal. So managers, which when they start doing the process, they are made aware of these errors, because what they don't want to be able to do in this situation is be more lenient or being more strict, being overlooking in some cases, or asking questions which are not a part of the process. And when you are getting into that position of doing the appraisal, you're more aware of these areas that you could fall prey to easily because you're not used to that process. So HR will document this and say, okay, you're going to be doing the first set of appraisals for your employees, and you've not done this before. You need to go through this system that we have in the organization, and these are the areas that you need to avoid. And the areas that you need to avoid are, errors which could happen when you're doing the final grading or the appraisal, and it could be leniency errors, central tendency errors, or recency bias errors. Okay. Large organizations would have it. In small organizations, businesses, what you will see is the owner or the director of the company, or maybe a HR manager itself, has the whole authority to be able to do appraisal, and they don't tend to follow an elaborate process like this. They tend to follow the process in which the job description becomes the benchmark, how much target was given, or what the goals and objectives were set, and have you met these goals and objectives. They tend to value against that, and they don't go into other parameters which could be related to giving, say, bonus, employee stock option, benefits, and things like that. But where you have all these parameters playing into in big organizations like, say, and we talk about Google, Facebook, Microsoft, wherein an employee gets a pension plan, they get holidays, they get other benefits like medical insurance. Other benefits could be you're in line for bonus and incentive apart from the salary. This is where they want to look at a rating scale where these errors do not happen, which means unfair payments could go to, or more payments could go to a system or an employee wherein the performance appraisal has been done leniently. That means you're in line for a higher bonus. Now, it does say in the HR manual example that in, say, for example, when you work in Google, and if you're meeting your target 100%, you are in line for 5% rise in salary. But if you're meeting 125% of your target, you're in line to get 15% raise in your salary. But if the leniency error is applied, and I have an employee which I'm appraising as a manager, and he's my favorite or she's my favorite, I might say, okay, you achieve 125% of your target. And that would mean I've done a leniency error, and that employee would have ended up getting 15%. But somebody that I don't like in the organization, in my own department, I would say, okay, you've done well, you've done average, you've achieved 100%, but I think you've not achieved 125% or whatever. And in that case, that employee only gets 5%. So those cases, in order to be avoided, the HR managers would instruct the line managers when they get into the appraisal system and they start doing the appraisal to avoid these errors, which can happen, and that tends to show biasness and leads, in some cases, it can lead to, repercussions of cases and employees representing that my appraisal wasn't fair and I was unfairly dismissed, blah, blah, blah. And that would mean additional headache and cost to the organization. So an HR manager and the HR departments would have this system in place in large organizations, and they create some sort of a scale and the pitfalls which need to be avoided when you do the appraisal. Okay? Okay. Now, some of the other guys, I'll go through quite quick. Now, when you schedule the appraisal, you have, say for you have to have a certain calendar notice that only, every year most organizations, if they follow a calendar year, January to December, they have appraisals in the December. So because just before Christmas break, you end up having the appraisal, you get the good news, you get a bonus and all that. Some companies have it at whatever cycles, they have to give notice before these appraisals as a cycle actually begins. Most companies have it in the last month of their financial year, whatever that is. And this tends to be a bit of a notice wherein employees start to collect a lot of data, things they've done correctly, records, and which can then be shared as things when the appraisal is done. So the idea is when you schedule an appraisal, you have to give advance notice. In some cases, when you look at this activity of appraisal, which tends to happen, you have to do appraisal for all employees, and the objectives of the appraisal have to be discussed clearly. So this has to be given. And then a benchmark of why a document will be used for appraisal will also will be in some cases provided. And this tends to be normally an annual activity in most organizations. Is that okay? Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to say something about this slide, but you've taken it away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, tell me.
You said you're doing the performance appraisals. Then could you please explain this again?
Right. So when you look at doing the activity of what tends to happen is that this is not something that you can do abruptly or then when you decide within the organization. What happens is when you do appraisals, it is always understood that there is a schedule that you will follow to do the appraisal for an employee. And it is not done just for one employee, but it is done across the department or across the organization. So normally an HR would have a timetable which gives advance notice to employees, maybe in some cases 10 days, week, 2 weeks. In some cases, you know that across the year, this is the time frame in which the appraisal system would typically kick in or would happen. Now, most employees are given this time period because they want to be able to prepare for this session. Sometimes you have to highlight your accomplishments, you want to gather some paperwork, you want to discuss a few issues. So it gives the opportunity to the employee to also prepare for this whole process. Okay? Because you have to, here is where the process of self-appraisal comes in. Most good organizations, when I say good organization, means organizations which take this system very seriously, what they tend to do is they send across some sort of a self-evaluation form to the employee 2 or 3 weeks in advance before the appraisal date. And what they tend to do in that is they say, okay, can you self-appraise yourself to see how good you were, what have you accomplished, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and that is where the discussions actually tend to start. And they tend to focus on objectives, goals that you achieved, things that went wrong, things went right, or where these things you felt could have been improved. And this is to take feedback from the employee and get the employee participating in the whole activity of performance appraisal. Okay. Most organizations, big, small, medium, whatever you look at, have this as a process which is primarily an annual process. They don't see this as a process which happens every month. They don't see this as a process which happens every 3 months. Most see them as an annual process of appraising the employee's performance once. Okay. Now, the other thing we talk about, which is, things like how does it happen? Sometimes it's interview, sometimes there are corrections, sometimes it's just to do with you filled up a document. Most organizations have a PDP or a personal development plan. They ask you to fill that plan up. And once you fill that plan, they come in and discuss, and that is an activity which happens wherein you're participating and the employer is also discussing with you to see how it goes forward. So tell and sell interviews talk about supervise normally persuade employee change in a correct way. And this tends to happen in a place wherein you're looking at, situations wherein it's very junior employees in the organization, and you have to give them direct feedback to be able to clearly say, if you have to improve, you have to improve in these areas, and that's it. There is no discussion on that. Because this is normally done in case of employees who are in the front line or at the very junior positions within the organization. And you want to see this change because that will help improve your area or your department in terms of efficiency, performance, or productivity. Okay? So these are tell and sell. That means you tell them, if they don't agree, you fire them. As simple as that. Now, tell and listen would be when your supervisor comes discusses that these are strength areas, these are weaknesses. Look at getting some feedback from you and deal with disagreements non-defensively. That means they will not be aggressively dealing with you if you have a disagreement during those tell and listen interviews. And they would negotiate with you because they know they cannot fire you. They know if I fire you, I have to find a replacement. So it is not an either or situation, but this is a situation wherein they need you to follow certain leads, but they are able to not enforce this onto you, and they are able to negotiate and discuss with you to take this forward. And that is why they are tell and sell kind of interviews which tend to happen when the results happen. The third one would be problem solving. Now here, what the interviewer or the appraisal person who's doing the appraisal actually sees is that you've gone through a number of appraisals. It's not the first time you're having it in the organization. So they know your strengths and weaknesses in clear. They know what are the feelings of the subordinates, that how they feel about you when they want to discuss or discover a problem or discuss a problem with you. They are willing to accept and also willing to listen. But what they tend to then do in that case is they are willing to listen to you to be able to solve a problem which is not just a problem being highlighted by you, but also by subordinates. A typical example of this would be that, say for example, when you look at a lot of retail stores, what you see is that the general managers normally tend to rota manage. They have a budget which has been given and they want to maximize that budget in terms of having most of the staff available on the weekends when you have more footfalls. But in some cases, during the course of the day or weekdays, they do not want that many people in because they want to save on the budget and have more workers work on Friday, Saturday, and Sundays. Now, what this tends to do is they tends to create a problem wherein there's a lot of stress on employees because you're barely or thinly staffed, or you're basically not adequately staffed when you have peak busy periods during the weekdays. So this is a problem which somebody discovers, but what they have to do is they have to solve this problem by also giving a feedback to the manager or the person involved who's doing the rota to say that these issues are coming up time and again and they are being highlighted by subordinates. So what you need to do is either you need to solve this issue or you need to then get somebody else to basically look into this. And these tend to be what you call problem solving interviews. You discuss a problem and you give a solution and you solve it. You are not going to look at the issue of, I'm going to tell you to do this or I'm going to tell you and then negotiate. No, there's a problem that needs to be solved and you give a clear instruction that how it needs to be solved. And that is why they tend to be something called problem solving interviews. Is that okay? Are you able to see the difference?
Yes.
Okay. Then you have appraisal interviews. These are interviews which typically aim to happen when you are discussing in detail and the appraisal is happening as an activity. And you emphasize on a lot of things. You emphasize on the area of strength. You talk about certain areas which are, areas wherein there are gaps, and it could be gaps at the organizational end, at the person's end, department end, and then focus on some of the opportunities. So here it's a mutual discussion which is happening, and you're discussing holistically the whole process, the organization, the individual, the role, and the job description. And the approach which most employers here take would be they have a participating interactive discussion during the process of, appraisals and interviews. Okay?
Okay.
Now
you said something here, appraisals interview, the techniques. Hello?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, the techniques. You said use a variety of types of questions. Could you please explain on that?
So here what will happen is, in order to say, coming to another problem, what they're going to do is they're going to, sometimes you do some, they ask during the appraisals or during the interview stage, you are asked to do some tests. But if you see those tests, some of them have the same repeated questions, but they are, kind of worded differently. But they all tend to kind of focus on understanding what is the real area, or what is the type of leadership you'll offer, or what is the type of, say for example, manager you would be, what are the areas you will concentrate on. Some of these questions are asked from different angles, but they want to try and get to the same, the understanding of why these things are being done or are happening in the organization. So a variety of questions here would mean that in order to find out if there's a problem or if there is an issue or there's things which are going right, they are best practices they want to pick up, they will ask and probe you, and during the performance appraisal by asking you different types of questions. Case in point, example, you're having a performance appraisal, you work as an HR manager, you are having your own appraisal, right? So the general manager, who's the HR, he's doing an appraisal for his own employee, own department employee, HR manager. He is going to ask you a lot of questions. And the idea is he wants to get insight into how the appraisal system is working. So he might ask you questions: how many people have you interviewed? How many people were, forthcoming to do the appraisals? What are the line managers involved? What are the key areas or problem areas which have been flagged up during the appraisals? Do you think in general the employees are happy with the appraisals? So here he's asking a variety of questions to gauge the overall system of appraisals being an HR manager. So sometimes in order to get to the bottom of the problem or the issue, you have to ask questions in different manner. And that is what it means, that you have to ask a variety of questions to be able to pinpoint a particular problem, issue, or a best practice area when you do the open-ended interviews, when you do the interviews through the appraisal system, but these interviews are open-ended questions. Okay?
What about avoid the sandwich technique?
Now, here, what you're trying to do is you're trying to avoid putting the person into a situation wherein the person will either or have to choose, something when they have to reply. So you're going to be asking tricky questions which talks about, you're not giving much options, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to corner the employee, agreeing to something, either or situation. So an example in the case of, this would be when you look at, a sandwich technique would be that you want either a positive or a negative answer. You want a binary answer, which is 0 and 1. And here what you're looking at is you're going to be looking at a method primarily to understand, are you going to stay with the organization or are you going to leave the organization if this is not to happen? So the sandwich technique is used by managers as a tool to basically kind of gently do constructive criticism. You have two sides to the coin, and you're having the say on both sides of the coin. So this is a way to look at giving constructive criticism to the employee, and that is why this is called a sandwich technique, because the manager always has the upper edge and is able to either give you this side of things or that side of things, and that is why it tends to be called the sandwich technique. Is that okay?
Okay.
Binary 0 and 1, you look at it, two sides of the coin, and both the sides, the manager has a perspective, or the person who is doing the review in your case has the better say on both sides of the situation. If you go this way, then also there's a point that he will make. If you go on the right way, then also there will be a process, say a way wherein he'll be able to make a point. This then tends to be a technique wherein sometimes managers use it to give negative feedback rather than constructive feedback. And that is why, it has two sides, and it's called the sandwich technique. Okay? So give positive comment, give negative comment, sometimes constructive criticism, sometimes you look at, negative criticism, and that is why the sandwich technique. Now, the balanced step of sides, talk about some of the methods. Then we looked at rating scale. One of the top rating scale which we talk about would be, BARS. Now, BARS is a scale which, HR uses, and that stands for behaviorally anchored rating scale. That means an approach wherein a performance consists of vertical scales, and each of this has a dimension related to your job performance. An example of a bar scale is that you have low, average, and high. You define good, you define average, good, and good. Or you say you have a fair, poor. You could have 4, which is a poor, you say fair, good, and excellent. So you define a bar in terms of how the measurement of the performance can be done, and that is why it will be called the bar scale. Now, sometimes you have a graphic scale. Here we are talking about the organization has some sort of criteria, which are qualitative criteria, and again some open-ended multiple choice questions wherein they tend to look at you doing some sort of rating or you filling up some sort of a scale. Now, sometimes you go to a hotel and you see that they do graphic rating scales. Were you happy? And they make smileys, and were you very happy? 2 smileys. If you were ecstatic or very happy. Sometimes when you go to Pizza Hut or TGI, thank God it's Friday, you ring a bell that you were very happy with the food being served and it's served on time, and you ring a bell before you go. So those tend to be scales wherein you're trying to excite emotions by looking at using of graphics. Is that okay?
Okay. Every
organization would tend to have some sort of a scale on which they do the measurement of that performance. And that measurement could be, on a numeric scale, a graphic scale. And the idea is after the performance appraisal has happened, you always are served by a questionnaire or a feedback to say that, how did you feel about the process? What did you think went right? What did you think went wrong? What are the areas that you would want to approach differently? And in cases, what are the areas you would want the employer to focus and approach differently? So that feedback mechanism tends to be, some sort of a scale. And in some cases, when you look at large organizations, they tend to have this scale, which basically look at getting this data into some sort of a numeric form. Because at the background, when you fill this questionnaire up or you fill this survey, what they are doing is they are calculating this into and tabulating it relating to some numbers, which overall gives them some sort of a result or a rating. And that rating tends to be on a particular scale. Now, there is a forced choice method which we talk about, which is basically an approach which is taken in the performance appraisal, which requires you to, make statements and distinguish between, force you to take a distinction between whether it was achieved, not achieved, yes or no. So here you're looking at binary. Now, sometimes you will see these kind of appraisals tend to happen when people look at hiring people in the sales position or critical areas which are critical to the organizational performance. So if you see most CEOs when they are inducted into the organization, they are given quantitative objectives, or in some cases qualitative objectives. Now an example here would be that most CEOs when they are coming into a role for 3 years, 5 years, whatever, or football managers when they are given contracts, you will see they will say you have to improve the performance of the team from the last 20 to first 20. The team has to go to the top 10. In the case of CEOs, it could be things like you have to move the market share, from 4% to 5%. You're looking at savings in terms of, in organization savings because of your leadership and management by 10% or 5%. Those kind of objectives which are forced in a way to evaluate your performance. You meet them or you don't meet them. There is nothing in the middle. Either you meet them or you don't meet them. There is nothing in the middle. And those tend to be something called the forced choice method of rating. Now, sometimes you look at essay methods. Have you come across essay method of rating?
No.
Okay. I'll give you a typical
That's
example.
like a written examination.
It is because what happens in this method is that the performance appraisal requires you to rate your own, form filling or say your own performance, and this is done on the basis of you having to fill up a form. Now, most organizations today now have an electronic employer, rating system. Now, this would mean when you go through that process, you've done the rating. What they tend to do is they ask you to fill up a survey. A simple example that I will give you here is an essay method would be if you buy something from the company, they send you a questionnaire to fill in to rate their performance or rate their level at which they were able to help you, and that would be an essay method because they're asking you to rate or choose or do multiple choice questions to kind of rate how the efficiency, performance, the issue they've solved was, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So if you buy something on Amazon and you want to do a refund, you've done the refund, they send you a questionnaire and you have to basically fill that questionnaire up, and that's an essay method. They don't ask a verbal feedback, they want a written feedback, and the written feedback which is created tends to be something called an essay method. Now, lastly, before we close, because I think it's a very long session, there is something also which is done, we've used this term before, which is called management by objective. Now, a lot of organizations have performance appraisal systems, but one of the systems through which they do performance, like the 360-degree appraisal process, like the balanced scorecard, they also look at doing the process of appraisals through something called management by objective. Now, this was a philosophy which originated in the early 19th centuries, and this was this was proposed first by a great person who's is considered a marketing guru called Peter Drucker, and he basically based this on the philosophy of management, saying that the performance of the employees can actually be rated to the achievement of the goals which are set, and they look at numbers primarily. Management objectives, you give tasks, and those tasks, if they are achieved, you say that the performance is good, the management, the results are met, and it basically looks at these objectives being fulfilled to rate the performance of the individual when appraisals are done. And they look at following something called MBOs, management by objective. That means you're a task-oriented manager, and you manage your employees and staff by basically giving them tasks. If they achieve those tasks, they are meeting the criteria. If they do not achieve those tasks, they are not meeting the criteria. Now, this is an approach as guarded by a lot of organizations over years, but still is in practice at higher levels of management. Because when you have to give quantitative, feedback, and you have to measure the performance by numbers, in those cases, what you have to do is you have to basically look at management by objectives. And those areas tend to be something called MBOs. So there are some advantages, like employees can measure performance. There are quantifiable goals. That means you can measure them easily. Sometimes they require joint effort, and sometimes you will see that there's a lot of satisfaction that you've achieved it as a team, and you share the benefits of that as a team. Disadvantages could be sometimes you see that this does not always propose or validate, studies from a point of view of, not all employees agree with management by objectives. It cannot be applied across the organization. This has to happen at a certain level within the organization for it to be managed. Sometimes you see people will not be agreeing to being managed by MBOs because they see the goals being set are quite unrealistic. And that is where you see that MBO does not work, and in some cases they see this as a disadvantage because they say it works only for the top management or the people in senior positions, but not for the people in junior positions. Now, you also have a disadvantage wherein people tend to do not agree with the objectives being given. There is no commitment from the people in terms of managing because the objectives being set are too big or not achievable and not realistic. So sometimes this as a concept is also disadvantageous because people tend to not agree being managed by objectives because they feel the timelines being given are unrealistic. It is not possible to achieve it within the times given, and that's why they feel negative about it. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Now, towards the end, let's look at summarizing. Let's look at understanding why performance and measuring of performance is important. Now, if you see any organization which is successful, profitable, growing, has some sort of process within the organization at the end of the day to manage and to basically measure performance. If you are not achieving what you are given in terms of goals, or if you're not achieving the target, then the overall organization does not achieve the target. So it is in the interest of the organization to measure goals and measure the performance of the individual, how they're doing on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-on-month basis. Now, when the goals and objectives are set at the highest level, they are then broken down into specific department goals, specific targets or objectives for each and every individual in the organization, because you are employed for the greater good of the organization. You are employed because you want to achieve the overall objective and help in achieving the overall objective of the organization. So that is where measurement of performance becomes important. Now, before the targets are agreed and before the performance method in terms of appraisal has to start, these have to be agreed by the individual. So here, sometimes you will see that when the targets are set or when qualitative and quantitative targets are set for employees, depending on which department, which area they work, you will have to have an agreement between the two parties to say that I agree or I do not tend to agree. And these then, once are agreed, are put down into job description and are put down into the activity or the activity in terms of towards the end of the year, looking at measuring you within those activities that you have agreed. So once the goals have been given and the goals have been agreed, they are to be measured to see the overall performance of the individual within the organization. Okay, so that is why measuring of performance is important. Now, as an example, what we've looked at is, this is something which I'm going to change, but as an example, I'm going to try and look at the process of how you will look at performance appraisal. So it talks about description, a process. We develop this as a system, PM. Once the system is developed, it is reviewed, and then because most of the benefits of the performance appraisal talk about compensation, talk about bonus incentive, we talk about increases in pay, wage rise. Those decisions create a positive feeling, and that is why it is associated with that at the end of the appraisal system, at the end of the evaluation, I will end up having an increase in pay, and that is why pay is one of the key things that comes out of the appraisal system. Last but not the least, when you look at appraising individuals, there is, when you talk about the process of self-appraisal, sometimes you will also have a number of skills assessment to be done. That means the employees will undergo some sort of an assessment during the time of performance appraisal, and there could be various types: interview discussions, essay discussions, multiple choice questions, and these are done primarily to assess the skills of the individual, to find out areas wherein they would need training and development. So at the end of it, they want to come to a situation wherein we need to find out how does it help, which are the areas which are gap areas, and which are the areas in which the skills need to be developed. So they identify, using the skills assessment method, that what are the skills that the employee needs to develop, and that tends to then complete the process of appraisal. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Now, what are the key documents that you will look at when you look at doing the appraisals? There is always an appraisal form. Now, when the appraisal has been done, it has to be signed off by the management that, okay, there's a supporting document which comes out. I've done the appraisal. The employees come out as meeting the criteria, exceeding criteria, not meeting the criteria, and that leads to an increase in pay, some compensation, some benefit being given, and this then leads to something called a PMF form or a performance management form. That means the CEO or the organization head would sign it off saying that, okay, I authorize this pay rise of 5% for this employee basis the appraisal which has happened.
Okay.
Once that has happened, a self-evaluation form is filled so that they get the feedback from the employee that you're happy with the appraisal which has been done, and they talk about in that form questions on which they want feedback from the individual for the organization. Now, sometimes that form also helps collect something called best practices. What were the key issues which were important and why these were dealt by the employee or by self-initiative, and those then tended to create a success for the organization. So some of them then are identified and then are put together as a bit of a case study, which could be then shared with other employees or other departments to say that these are the areas which helped a particular person achieve the objectives, and those then tend to be something called CSF, critical success factors. This is primarily when you get to see an example, case studies of employee appraisal, happy employees faces that, okay, at the end of the year exercise, the organization has done appraisal for, say, X number of employees. All of them who were appraised, say, example, 500 were appraised, 490 of them gave a 5-star rating to the employee that the organization was fair, the system was fair, and they're happy with the outcome of the, and that is then published as something in the annual journal report as being the success factors of the appraisal system. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Now, when you call in organizations like PwC, KPMG, Ernst & Young, and they help you refine the process of evaluation year and year, after a few years, if the system has become old, and they come in and suggest new system or new measures to look at employee appraisal, and they look at the whole overall system of appraisal, and they send then after doing the study, they submit you some feedback that these are things that you need to change, or if this system is aptly right for appraisals in the organization. An example would be, when you look at software organizations, they have a lot of programmers and they have a lot of stress when they are coding. So their appraisal system is very different. When you look at an organization which is mostly engineering or production, their appraisal systems are slightly different. So what organizations tend to do is they pick up systems which can be customized with the help of consultancy firms, and when they customize those systems to meet the requirement of what it will help get and capture, they then tend to be published as something called evaluation processes which are apt for that organization. Now, if you have Army, for example, in Army, you will have a different kind of an appraisal system as compared to a public sector organization and as compared to a private sector organization. Would you tend to agree?
I don't understand what you're saying.
So if you look at picking up an appraisal system and you want to apply it across organizations, you will not be able to do that. You have to have a bespoke or a tailored system which is applicable to a type of organization. So if you have to do appraisals in an army, in an organization like armed forces, there the system is different. If you have a public sector organization, there the system appraisal is different. When you have a private sector organization or a private organization, there the appraisal system is slightly different, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Correct? Because when you look at the structure of the organization like armed forces, the rule is autocratic. That means the top man, the top general, and he passes the order, everybody follows. So, basis the leadership type and the organization culture, the evaluation process or the system of performance appraisal in organization also differs. So, when you have large setups, you will see that this as a system is passed on to professional organizations like Ernst & Young, PwC, or big accountancy and other firms, HR organizations, which come in and do the appraisal on behalf of the organization because it is seen to be non-biased and it is done by entirely somebody who's outside the organization to treat that process in a fair and respectable manner.
Okay.
Okay, so that is where you will get to see that you have some types of forms and you have some types of particular documentation which has to be followed when we look at the system of appraisal within or measuring performance within organization.
So to avoid bias, it's advisable one use external bodies to come and do the performance appraisals, because if it's in-house, there could be bias. Is that what you're saying?
That is so basically, in some cases, when you have, it could work in both ways. If you have a very small organization, you do not have HR, what they tend to do is they outsource that function to somebody else, and they are specialists in their HR, and what they will do is they'll once a year offer the activities, do the HR side of things, and do the performance appraisal. So it does not seem to be biased. But in large organizations, sometimes what they do is they also outsource this to big organizations wherein they want this process to be transparent, non-biased, and absolutely, crystal clear in order to reduce costs, but also to look at transparency. And that is why the appraisal process sometimes is outsourced.
Okay.
Okay. Now, with this, we have come to the end of this particular unit, which is leadership and management. What I'm going to do for today's section is going to send you this, obviously, the presentation, but I will send you a bit of a handout to understand what a performance appraisal method. And we have to focus on, we have covered this in large, very great detail. But in order for looking at understanding, the key ones which are used, we're going to focus on 360-degree feedback, balanced scorecard, and management by objectives.
Okay.
Okay. And then once you do this further reading, we should be then looking at, getting hold of a bit of a draft from your end, and then we will, start the next week.
Okay.
Okay. Good stuff. Thank you for attending the session. You have a good weekend, and I will check with you next week to fix up dates for the next session.
Okay, you forward those materials to me, right?
Yes, I sent that yesterday's thing to you before we started the session today. And today, once I will send you in a couple of minutes. When I say couple, maybe in an hour's time, once I get the recording of this session.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
You take care. Thank you.